All right, well, let's go ahead and begin then and talk more about the muscular system and muscles and how muscles work. And we'll use the PowerPoint because I want to start tonight by talking about when muscle contracts. What we saw uh, in our lecture on Tuesday was that muscles contract because of the interaction of two proteins, right? You had the big fixed filamentous protein called myosin, and you had that sliding protein called actin, and the myosin basically, like, for example, let's say that you were to be part of a team that was pulling something with a rope. You'd reach your hand out and pull the rope, and then the next hand and pull the rope, and the next hand and pull the rope, right? And so that's kind of what happens at the protein level. The proteins are grabbing, pulling, releasing, grabbing, pulling, releasing, and the filaments slide over each other. So we get into this discussion of muscle and its ability to contract when you're actually seeing a change to the position of the joint, or if a muscle's contracting and just holding the joint in a specific position. So there's a difference of discussion. In other words, I can, let's say, get into an arm wrestling match with somebody, right? And I can work really hard to try to win the wrestling match. But if I'm not stronger than the person I'm arm wrestling, instead of winning the match, I'm losing the match, right? The muscles are still contracting, but the joint's going the wrong way. That's because the amount of force against the contraction force is greater than what the muscles can generate, right? So I'm losing the arm wrestling match. If we're in a stalemate where I'm going and he's going, nobody's winning, but the muscles are certainly contracting. And if I'm winning, I easily just overpower the person I'm arm wrestling with, right? Well, you can almost think of that with any muscle contraction because there's always some kind of force on your body, whether that contraction's with the direction of gravity going down to the ground, against the direction of gravity, right? So there's a difference in a muscle contracting when I'm going against gravity or a muscle contracting when I'm going with gravity. For the most part, if I'm working against gravity, I have to take the weight of whatever it is I'm trying to move and bring it against gravity. So let's say it's a 20-pound weight. When I go to lift that, I'm lifting that 20 pounds off the ground, off the table, off the chair, whatever it's off, against gravity, right? But when I go to put the 20-pound weight back down, I don't just let go of it and let it fall down. I slowly release to let it go back down to where it's controlled. The same muscles that lifted the weight are actually letting the weight slowly go back down because the muscle power is greater than the weight of 20 pounds when I'm lifting it. And then I let my muscle equal to 20 pounds and then slowly have contraction less than the amount of 20 pounds to let gravity and the force of that essentially win the arm wrestling match. So it's a controlled descent. In other words, the muscles don't just relax to let objects fall. We can, but that can break things, not just on you, but whatever it is you're holding. And the goal is not to break anything, it's to control movement. So we see different types of contraction based upon what forces are upon the body. And contraction, again, is by definition the shortening of muscle fiber, even though we technically see a type of contraction where muscle fibers lengthen. So it's kind of a misused term to say a muscle's contracting when it's lengthening. It should be that it's contracting or extending, if you will. But it's not. It's contracting either way to where sometimes the muscle fibers shorten and sometimes the muscle fibers lengthen. There's even a type of contraction where the muscle fibers don't move at all. They don't lengthen or shorten. They just hold. And so that's what we want to break down is those types of contractions. I feel like there it is. So we've got this thing called isotonic and isometric muscle contractions. Isotonic, if we break down the definition, it means equal tension. Isotonic is equal tension. Isometric means equal distance. And these are the types of muscle contraction that you can observe just by looking at any person at any given time on any given day. Turns out there's a third type of contraction called isokinetic, which means same energy. And in order to observe that, you'd have to see somebody on a machine that's adjusting to the type of contracting they're doing. So one of those real expensive in the gym machines that either has a hydraulic system or a computer or something like that. All right, I don't want to make this too confusing, so I'll try it this way. There are three things to know about muscle: how long the muscle is, how tight the muscle is, and how much energy the muscle would use. All right, let me say those again. How long the muscle is, or how short, how tight the muscle is, or how loose, how flaccid, and how much energy or how little energy the muscle uses to achieve a contraction. These are the three, if you will, landmarks of muscle: how long, how tight, how much energy. And so when the muscle actually contracts on a physics scale, a physics discussion, when a muscle contracts, two of the three things will change, but one of those three will always stay constant. In other words, if the tension of the muscle doesn't change, but the length of it is getting longer or shorter and the energy is being used more or less, guess what? That's what we would call an isotonic contraction, because the tension stayed the same throughout. It didn't get any looser or any tighter. It stayed the same tightness, but it got longer or shorter, and it burned through fuel. That is your typical isotonic contraction. And I'll give you examples of all this, and I'll simplify it. I'm just giving you the physics behind it right now. Now, let's say that the tension's getting tighter, 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 but the length is not changing. It's staying the same. It's not shortening. It's not lengthening. It's staying the same. Getting tighter, 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 burning through more and more fuel. That's when it's an isometric contraction, because isometric means same distance, same length. It's definitely getting tighter. It's definitely burning through fuel. It's just not changing length. On special machines, not free weights or anything like that, on machines that can be programmed or designed to adjust to how much contraction you are doing, we call those isokinetic machines. It allows the energy to stay the same so that you don't really fatigue, you don't burn through your fuel, but allows muscle tension to change and allows length to change. And that's actually really a pretty impressive way to strengthen muscle, because it maintains the energy of the muscle. But unless I have a machine that I can put you on to show you that, I can't just show you an example of isokinetic. So most books, including this one, don't even include isokinetic in the discussion. But isotonic and isometric are easily observed types of muscle contraction. So I'm going to take this really, really heavy, that was me hitting the bowl, sorry. This really, really heavy wand, stick, I don't know, the thing that is used for the bowl, okay? So it's heavy, right? And I've added that to the weight of my forearm, and now I got to move my forearm, which means muscles like biceps brachii, which is not attached to the humerus, have to shorten or lengthen or shorten or lengthen, shorten, lengthen. As long as you can see the movement, the tension in the muscle is not changing, but it's moving. It's certainly going to burn up fuel, right? This is what you would call isotonic contraction. Whether it's shortening or lengthening, it's still isotonic contractions, because it's changing length. And the thing is when we talk about muscle, even though it's named for what's staying the same, we describe it by what's changing. Because if you were to look at me doing these movements, your first thought wouldn't be, oh, the muscle tension staying the same. What you're seeing is long, short, long, short, long, short, right? Getting longer, getting shorter, getting longer, getting shorter. I can see that change. But what's really staying constant is the tension. And unfortunately, we name muscle contractions not by what's changing, but by what stays the same. And that is because when there's three characteristics of muscle, length, tension, and energy, one of them will always stay the same while the other two change. So it's just which pattern. Is it the length staying the same while the energy and the tension change? Is it the tension staying the same while the length and the energy change? Or is it the energy staying the same while the length and tension change? So it sounds really kind of confusing, but it's really very basic. And it's the difference between holding a muscle contraction where you're not moving or muscle contractions where you are moving. Let me ask you this. Have you ever done the stand in the doorway, press your arms out into the door, and then you go to relax your arms after, say, a minute of doing it, and your arms start raising on their own? Have you ever done that? Okay. Some people are like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I got to tell you, I was probably in my mid to late 20s the first time I ever saw it. Some kids learn it as kids and do it, but it's just one of those things where you can actually show 60 seconds of isometric muscle contractions, and then it's just the tornado running. And then when the muscle goes to relax, it starts working on its own, even though your brain didn't tell it to. Okay? So, isotonic and isometric are the two types of contraction we're going to focus on. If it's isotonic, you will see the movement of the joint, whether it's flexing and extending or abducting or adducting or elevating or depressing or whatever those, you remember all those words we matched up on the skeletal system test? If you're observing those changes, those movements, the muscle that's pulling and shortening or lengthening is doing that movement isotonically. Have you ever just done a wall sit? Like, I remember basketball practice. At the end of basketball practice, our coach would make us do wall sits. You feel the burn in those quadriceps, don't you? Uh-huh. And you got to hold it and hold it and hold it and hold it and hold it. That is totally isometric, right? Let's say I've got a pull-up bar and I go to do a chin up and I'm just holding myself. That's isometric. Letting myself down is isotonic, pulling myself up is isotonic, but when I hold it still, it becomes isometric. Because as long as the muscles are contracting, but you're not moving, it's isometric. Okay? Isotonic, you do see movement. Isometric, you don't see movement. I sure hope the rain washes all the pollen off my car. All right, let me give you examples of both of these. On the screen, and I'll zoom in on it so you can see it a little bit better. This arm with this biceps has that heavy ball in it, and it's bringing the arm on the lower one here, it's bringing the ball closer to the body by bending the elbow. That biceps brachii muscle is shortening, it's contracting and pulling the forearm in, right? Is the biceps brachii muscle shortening? Is movement occurring at the elbow? Indeed. So we would call that an isotonic contraction. And because the muscle is shortening, we say that it is a concentric isotonic contraction. Concentric literally means toward the center. The two ends are pulling to the center, shortening the muscle. So the muscle belly shortens, it broadens because the mass has to go somewhere. So as the length of it gets shorter, the thickness of it gets wider, right? You've seen that with muscles. When you make muscles contract, they broaden out. So this is isotonic when it's concentric. But as the person goes to let that ball back down, instead of just relaxing and letting it fall with gravity, the biceps brachii, which is not attached to the humerus, is going to slowly release. And now it's losing the tug of war, losing the arm wrestling battle, so that gravity is winning, but it's still controlled, right? You could stop and hold it there and make it isometric, or you can continue to let it elongate, which is an isotonic eccentric contraction. Eccentric literally means away from center. So as long as it's lengthening or shortening, it's always isotonic. Once it just holds, it instantly becomes isometric in its discussion. So in this particular manner, this biceps brachii, elbows bent, and the person tries to pull the bar toward them as hard as that person can. But because the bar is so fixed, it's not going anywhere. Right? if I decide right now, I want to go outside and I don't know, pick up my car. How successful am I going to be in picking up my car? Yeah, I'm not that strong. Doesn't mean I can't try with all my might and make my muscles contract. I'm just not going to be strong enough. The force of, if you will, the weight of the car is greater than the amount of force I can generate to overpower that and lift it. I had a student this morning ask me, he said, because one of my statements was, if you work muscles, they get stronger and stronger and stronger. Okay? The more you work muscles, the stronger they get. So he said, so what you're saying is I could eventually get strong enough to where I could pick up this building? And I looked at him and my first thought was, well, I'm not going to tell you what my first thought was, but my second thought was, you're not going to live long enough to get that strong. Will he live long? Will any of us live long enough to get so big and strong that we can lift a building? Only if it's made of popsicle sticks. Right? Or straws. You're correct. Look, he could get really big and strong and maybe lift a retaining wall, as long as it's not cemented to something else and physically connected to where, you got to be even stronger. But he's not a small kid. He'll eventually be pretty darn big and strong. But realistically, what human being's ever going to be strong enough? I mean, there aren't very many human beings that can go out and lift up cars. I mean, there are some really small cars that they might be able to lift, but I mean, we're talking about realistic. And realistically, very few humans can lift 1,000 pounds, 500 pounds even. Are there people that can lift over 500 pounds? Maybe squatting style with their legs. I don't know about bench pressing. I don't know what the world record is. If I had to take a guess, the world record for a bench press or like an overhead press is probably around 600 or 700 pounds, is a guess. It'd be easy to look up. But that person doesn't look like me. That person lifts weights all the time, lifts heavy objects all the time. That person's not just going to walk up and go, let's try the 700 pounds. Boom, boom. In fact, I'm even curious now to see what the world record is for overhead lifting weights. Let's find out what the internet says about world record. I got to learn how to spell first. World record overhead press. The official world record for the overhead press is 235.5 kilograms. And I don't know what that relates to, pounds to kilograms. I don't remember. 236.5 kilograms. Let's convert that, shall we? 235.6 kilograms to pounds. And by the way, it's really sometimes based upon the size of the person too. I need to get rid of the word.
225 kilograms, 496 pounds.
Okay. Okay. So over 400 pounds, right?
Current raw world record for bench press is 770.
Yeah, I know bench press is a little easier than overhead press. So 519 pounds, almost 520 pounds, and then the bench press is over 700 pounds. Okay? Now again, none of those people look like me. They're probably shorter, much wider, with much bigger muscle mass. And is it true that as people keep on doing it, they get to 236 kilograms and 237 kilograms over time, right? And there's probably people that go back and forth breaking records like that. The Olympics will be starting here in a few weeks. You think you'll see some records being broken with the Olympic sports? Not just Olympic records, but world records? Because people get faster, people get stronger, people get bigger, right? So they're going to be jumping higher, jumping farther, running faster, lifting more weights. Those records will be broken, not smashed by 10, 15, 20 pounds, but maybe a few ounces. or a pound, or maybe a few milliseconds or microseconds. I don't know what the records are for racing and running, but the last time I saw a running record just smashed outright was when Usain Bolt broke that 9 second. Let's see, it was actually, there was a 10-second type world record, and he did something like 9.86 or 9.66 or whatever it was, and just smashed that 10-second record because they were just tenths of a second here or there breaking records until he came along. And I don't even know if he still holds that 100-meter record. But boy, that was awesome. He just ran. He ran over that jogging like he was passing us, and smashed that world record. Awesome. So when you're talking about isometric contractions, seeing if we're going to lose power. If you're talking about isometric contractions, the muscle is just holding, but you're not going to see any shortening or lengthening of the muscle, just holding, fixed muscle contraction. So let's think of times like, you remember being in PE class and you had to do sit-ups, right? How many sit-ups can you do? Remember doing that? And you would start doing your sit-ups. As you go up in your sit-up, that is a concentric abdominal muscle contraction where you're flexing the spinal column. And then as you go down, you didn't just fall down and smack your head on the ground. You use those same abdomen muscles to slowly release, go back down, and then back up. But you remember getting to the point as you're fatiguing and you kind of get stuck somewhere in the middle, and you just couldn't go anymore? In an instant, it became isometric when it was holding, because you lost all that energy. You burned through that fuel. So the energy changed, the length was changed, and all of a sudden, now the length doesn't change anymore. And then you work harder and harder and harder, increasing the tension, and you're just out of fuel. And then you just go down and you're done doing your sit-ups or doing push-ups. You get to a point where you just can't get yourself back up. You're pushing and pushing, and you're just holding, and then you're done. You went from isotonic, up and down, up and down, up and down, right? Until it finally became isometric, and then you were done. Or maybe you ever purposely try to stand like a mime or a statue and not move at all? Think about the number of isometric contractions you'd have to hold that position, right? If you've seen these people that dress up like statues, they're not moving at all, and then a person goes, and then they kind of scare them. Those are fun. So let's try this. Let's try showing you this in video form. And I'll show you isotonic versus isometric. And, again, there is a physics side to it as far as the amount of tension of the muscle, the amount of length of the muscle, the amount of energy of the muscle. But ultimately, is the muscle moving, or is it muscle not moving? If the muscle's moving, it's isotonic. If the muscle's not moving the joint, the contraction is isometric. If the muscle's relaxed, this is not part of the discussion, because this is just contraction. Has nothing to do with relaxation. Muscle being relaxed, you don't need to measure, right? Because the muscle's not being used. It's when the muscle's being used that you want to measure. So let's look at little YouTube videos of isotonic versus isometric. Let's see how well Google listens. I said isotonic, isometric. You got that for me? All right. Whoa, what's that? Well, I can do this one first. It'll be a good review of what we talked Tuesday. So I'll do that, since it was Tuesday discussion. All right, why isn't that going?
As I'm in the midst of applying for residency right now, wish me luck, Grammarly has again been a lifesaver with my application and helping me write my personal statement and
To move an object, referred to as load, the sarcomeres in the muscle fibers of the skeletal muscle must shorten. The force generated by the contraction of the muscle, or shortening of the sarcomere, is called muscle tension. However, muscle tension also is generated when the muscle is contracting against a load that does not move, resulting in two main types of skeletal muscle contractions: isotonic contractions and isometric contractions. In isotonic contractions, where the tension in the muscle stays constant, a load is moved as the length of the muscle changes. There are two types of isotonic contractions, concentric and eccentric. The concentric contraction involves the muscle shortening to move a load. An example of this is the biceps brachii muscle contracting when a hand weight is brought upward with
Biceps brachii, brachialis, and brachioradialis.
increasing muscle tension. As the biceps brachii contract, the angle of the elbow joint decreases as the forearm is brought towards the body. Here, the biceps brachii contracts as sarcomeres in its muscle fibers are shortening and cross bridges are forming. The myosin heads pull the actin. An eccentric contraction occurs as the muscle tendon diminishes and the muscle lengthens. In this case, the hand weight is lowered in a slow and controlled manner as the amount of cross bridges being activated by nervous system stimuli decreases. In this case, as tension is released from the biceps brachii, the angle of the elbow increases. Eccentric contractions are also used for the movement and balance of the body. An isometric contraction occurs as the muscle produces tension without changing the angle of a skeletal joint. Isometric contractions involve sarcomere shortening and increasing muscle tension, but do not move a load, as the force produced cannot overcome the resistance provided by the load. For example, if one attempts to lift a hand weight that is too heavy, there will be sarcomere activation and shortening to a point, and ever-increasing muscle tension, but no change in the angle of the joint. In everyday living, isometric contractions are active in maintaining posture and maintaining bone and joint stability. However, holding your head in an upright position occurs not because the muscles cannot move the head, but because the goal is to remain stationary and not to produce movement. Most actions of the body are a result of a combination of isotonic and isometric contractions, working together to produce a wide range of outcomes. All of these muscle activities are under the exquisite control of the nervous system. Neural control regulates concentric, eccentric, and isometric contractions.
That lightning was close, yeah. Okay, so here's Pat Kelly talking about isotonic and isometric.
Concentric versus eccentric versus isometric, isotonic, and isokinetic. At some point, every anatomy or kinesiology student needs to learn the difference between the major muscle contraction types. So in this video, I'll teach you the difference between these terms, how we use them outside of the classroom, and some tips for remembering them more easily. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Patrick, and this channel is all about anatomy and how we learn about it. As always, you can find the notes for this video linked in the description below. So why do we care about these contraction types? Well, they have a bunch of different clinical applications, and if you're designing an exercise or rehab program, you can accomplish different goals with your exercise prescription if you understand how these contractions work. For example, if you were rehabbing a rotator cuff injury, you'd probably introduce isometric exercises before concentric exercises, since your patient will have a reduced active range of motion. Or if your client doesn't quite have the strength to do a compound exercise, you can prescribe eccentric exercises as a way to develop skills and strength, like in this single leg squat example. We'll come back to this one. When you first learn how to differentiate between concentric, eccentric, and isometric contractions, you'll pay attention to one main factor: the change in muscle length. Isometric contractions happen when the force produced by the muscle of interest is equal to its resistance. Because of this, the joint doesn't move. That resistance can come from different places, like a dumbbell during a static hold exercise, gravity like during a plank, a surface like during wall presses, or even by your own muscles. For instance, when the wrist flexors and extensors contract on their own, they move the wrist in opposing directions. One muscle is the agonist, while the other is the antagonist. When you grip something in your hand, they contract at the same time in isometric contractions, producing the same amount of force as each other. As you grip harder, both sets of muscles contract harder, but the wrist joint still doesn't move since they're both producing the same amount of force as each other. Concentric contractions happen when the muscle produces more force than the load placed on it, causing the muscle to shorten, while eccentric contractions happen when the muscle produces less force than the load placed on it, causing it to lengthen. For example, a chin-up is a concentric contraction of your biceps, while lowering yourself down is an eccentric contraction of the biceps, or what fitness folks sometimes call a negative. Walking downhill is another common example of eccentric work. Your quads and calves generate force so you don't just stumble downhill. Does that mean that every time a muscle lengthens, it's an eccentric contraction? No. You can stretch your hamstring, which lengthens the hamstring. The difference between the muscle lengthening in a stretch and an eccentric contraction is whether the muscle is actively producing force or not. Now, those are your raw definitions. Just look at the length of the muscle. But there are some key differences between these contraction types that you might use in a clinical setting. Number one, each contraction type can exert different amounts of maximal force. Any given muscle can exert the smallest amount of maximal force concentrically, the largest amount eccentrically, and somewhere in the middle isometrically. This is how the single-legged squat example from earlier works. Maybe my muscles aren't strong enough to do a full up and down single-legged squat yet, but since they can produce more force eccentrically, I can at least do the down part of the squat single-legged. Then I use both legs to concentrically lift my body weight back up. But there's another big difference between them: energy expenditure. Eccentric contractions both produce the most force and cost the least amount of energy. To understand why both of these things are true, we need to see how muscle moves at the microscopic level. So I recruited my friend Peter to help explain and animate this one.
Hey, thanks, Patrick. Let's go full micro. Muscle tissue at the microscopic level looks something like this: a collection of overlapping bands of proteins arranged into the functional unit of a muscle called a sarcomere. The two proteins that get the most attention are actin and myosin, because their sliding action is what actually allows the sarcomere to shorten and the larger muscle to contract. If we zoom in even further, we'll see how they move, cross bridges. Little by little, these molecular actions cause actin and myosin to slide past each other in something called the sliding filament model. Now, their movement is powered by ATP, but there are a handful of proteins in the sarcomere that don't use energy during contraction. One of them is actually the largest known protein, titin, which connects the middle of the sarcomere all the way to the end. Titin is elastic, and one of the reasons why you don't rip your muscles apart when stretching. But it becomes a force producer when you actively contract your muscle thanks to calcium. During a muscle contraction, a bunch of calcium ions come into the muscle cell, which lets myosin and actin do their normal sliding filament thing, but it also causes titin to hook onto actin. As the muscle contracts, actin rotates, which causes titin to wind up around the actin protein, storing energy like a spring. Then, when the muscle lengthens in an eccentric contraction, titin unwinds and contributes to the overall force production of the sarcomere, allowing your muscles to produce more force at the macro level. Since titin doesn't require ATP and contributes to force production, this giant protein explains why eccentric contractions are more energy efficient and why you can produce more force eccentrically. Nice.
Before we move on, if you like those animations and need biochemistry help, go check out Peter's channel, This Glorious Clockwork. You won't be disappointed. It's linked up here and down in the description. Now, we've still got a few more contraction types to figure out: isokinetic and isotonic. And unlike the last three, these have nothing to do with muscle length. I'll explain. The prefix iso means same or equal. Isometric refers to the joint angle. It keeps the same joint measurement, or metric, throughout the contraction. Isotonic means same tone or tension, referring to a constant muscle tension throughout the contraction. Usually concentric and eccentric contractions fall under the umbrella of isotonic contractions. Now, during these kinds of lifts, the joint moves at different speeds. If you've done a heavy squat before, you move slower at the bottom than at the top of the motion. So while the muscle tension stayed the same, the joint speed did not. So our last type, isokinetic contractions, use some kind of machine to keep the joint motion at a constant speed. You could be going all out and really forcefully contract your muscles, or approach it super delicately, and the machine will match your force and keep your joint motion at the same speed. And these machines are cool. Like, they can be used like a traditional concentric eccentric machine, but they can also be programmed to be concentric in both directions. I've only used these kinds of machines in a research setting for my exercise physiology masters though, so I don't know how often you'd be prescribing isokinetic exercises in your traditional gym. In summary, isometric is the same joint angle, isotonic is the same muscle tension, and isokinetic is the same movement speed. Now, when you're analyzing someone's movement, you'll probably be asked which muscles are contracting in which style, and that's where we need some extra nuance. If you looked at a leg press, an exercise that's classically described as a quad and glute exercise, you'd actually find that other muscles of the knee and hip are also contracting. Like, your hamstring is contracting eccentrically to stabilize your knee. You'd potentially damage your ACL without it. So when we analyze movements, we usually look at the big agonist movers for a movement, but for completeness, know that other muscles are indeed activated. Cool, let's do some examples. My push-up technique has already caught some heat on this channel, so we might as well dissect it. When I push off the ground, can you label the muscles that are contracting concentrically? What about eccentrically? Remember, we're looking for moving joints, and in this case, my elbows and shoulder joints are my only moving joints. So in this case, my triceps and my pec major contract concentrically on the way up and eccentrically on the way down. Plenty of muscles are also working together to keep my core and hips in a straight line. So everything from abs, posterior neck muscles, and quads are contracting isometrically during a push-up. One more example. The side plank is a static hold exercise. No joints are moving, so we know we're looking for isometric contractions. But where? Personally, I like to imagine gravity pushing straight down, so I think about which muscles would push against it if it were a barbell or exercise machine. My oblique muscles and gluteus medius keep my hips off the ground, my deltoid keeps my rib cage from collapsing into my arm, and my upper trap, scalenes, and sternocleidomastoid keep my head up. Earlier in the video, Peter mentioned the sliding filament model, and if you want a more in-depth explanation of that concept, check out this video I made a while back. Thanks again to Peter for lending his talents to my channel. I'd highly recommend checking out this video about hemoglobin. And thank you to my patrons on Patreon for your support. Have fun, be good. Thanks for watching.
And for that, I'm going to go to one that's more physics oriented. And that is, there's Ninja Nerd. This one right here.
The words mean. ISO as muscles contract, they pull on tendons, which in turn pull on bones. This creates force and movement. There are three types of contractions: isotonic, isometric, and isokinetic. This seems like a pain to memorize until you give some thought to what the words mean. Iso means equal. So when we categorize our muscle contractions, we name them according to what stays the same throughout the contraction. We measure three things as we categorize contractions: tension across the muscle, the length of the muscle, and the amount of energy required by the muscle. In isotonic contractions, the muscle tension stays the same. The length of the muscle changes as the muscle contracts and pulls on the bone. The amount of energy required by the muscle may change, but the tension across the muscle stays the same. If the force the muscle is producing is greater than the opposing force, the muscle shortens. This is called a concentric contraction. If the force the muscle is producing is less than the opposing force, the muscle lengthens. This is called an eccentric contraction. So if this biceps muscle is being used to do curls, energy goes into the muscle to cause it to contract and pull on the tendon, which pulls on the bone. On the way up, the muscle force overcomes the weight of the dumbbell. This is a concentric contraction.
Okay, so the muscle is pulling the forearm bones toward the scapula, right? Because this is a biceps brachii that's pulling the radius, which makes the ulna move at the humerus. The muscle has to generate more power than the weight of the forearm plus that dumbbell. So let's pretend that that's a 10-pound dumbbell. The muscle needs to exert more force than the 10 pounds in order to create the movement of the forearm. Take away the 10 pounds, the muscle only needs to generate enough force to move the weight of the forearm. Agreed? Add 10 more pounds to it, the muscle has to be strong enough to then contract against that extra weight. Once the muscle force generated is greater than the amount of force that the weight is, you'll see the shortening take place of the muscle fiber. If for some reason the muscle's not strong enough to move that 10 pounds, it'll shorten and shorten and shorten. It's just not going to move the 10 pounds because it can't generate enough force to move it. So no matter how much the muscle contracts, it will never surpass the amount of force necessary. It can never be a concentric contraction. But I would expect with everybody in the room and everybody at home that you can easily take 10 pounds and bend your elbow with that added 10 pounds because your muscles should be strong enough to add 10 pounds of weight and generate enough force to then move those extra 10 pounds. Is there anyone here in the room or anyone at home that is not able to bend their elbow with 10 pounds added? All right. Now, if I made that a 100-pound weight, would you be able to do it? Certainly wouldn't be if it was a 150-pound weight, right? Because how often do you find yourself with just one arm having to lift 150 pounds bending your elbow? You're more likely to try to get under it and use your legs and your body and pick it up that way, right? And move it, not just grab 150 pounds and go watch this. In fact, I don't even know the last time I've even seen a 150-pound dumbbell. And trust me, 50-pound dumbbells, there's only a few contractions before you run out of energy if you're not used to doing it. If you do that over and over and over again every day at the gym, you'll easily, oh, you mean 100 of these? No problem. But those are going to be big, strong muscles that can generate enough power to shorten against those 50 pounds. Because we see it shortening and changing the angle of the joint to where it's flexing, it's isotonic toward the center, concentric. But again, when you go to let the arm straighten, you don't just drop that 50-pound weight. You let the muscle slowly lengthen to where the force of the muscle becomes less than the force of the weight. And now gravity's taking over and you're just fighting gravity until it's straight and you've got the position where you want it. Should you hold it there, instantly it's isometric. But as long as it's lengthening, it's isotonic, but away from center or eccentric. So let him talk more.
On the way down, the muscle is still contracting and creating force to oppose the dumbbell. If it didn't, the arm would just fall with the weight of the dumbbell. But the weight of the dumbbell is overcoming the force created by the muscle, and the muscle lengthens. This is an eccentric contraction. So isotonic contractions are the regular weightlifting contractions that we normally think of. Concentric isotonic contractions occur as the muscle overcomes the opposing force and shortens. Eccentric isotonic contractions occur when the force created by the muscle is less than the opposing force and the muscle lengthens. In isometric contractions, the muscle length stays the same. The tension across the muscle may change, and the energy required by the muscle may change in order to maintain the length, but the length stays the same. Think of the metric system being used to measure length. Isometric maintains an equal length. If this biceps muscle wants to maintain a constant length, it may require more tension and more energy depending on how much weight is added. But the length stays the same and the bones the muscle is pulling on don't move. Doing pull-ups requires isotonic contractions. The invisible chair requires isometric contractions. The pull-ups are a dynamic exercise where there is movement. The invisible chair is a static exercise where there is no movement. In isokinetic contractions, the energy required by the muscle stays the same throughout the contraction. The tension across the muscle may change and the length of the muscle changes, but a constant amount of energy is required. Isokinetic contractions are the most effective at building strength, but special machines are required to allow for isokinetic exercises. When a simple dumbbell is lifted, the energy may change throughout the contraction to maintain the same muscle tension. Isokinetic contractions can also be either concentric or eccentric.
If you're uninsured,
Okay, so that is the story of isometric versus isotonic. And again, don't worry about isokinetic because without the machinery, you won't be able to observe it. But in the scheme of massage therapy, we're really not ever having to design things worried about if it's isotonic or isometric. If you work in a gym and you're working on exercises and you're trying to design exercise for somebody, then you'd want to know, hey, this static exercise, you're holding it, it's isometric. This moving exercise, it's shortening, lengthening, that's isotonic. All I'm going to ask you is in true false form, is it isotonic or isometric? If it's shortening. Now, one of the things in Pat Kelly's video was he was saying agonist and antagonist. And we'll get into that when we see the slide, but ultimately that's describing if the muscle's a big player in the movement or if the muscle is working against that movement. Before we get into the types of title that muscles may carry with movement, let's talk about how the skeleton can act as a type of lever system to allow muscles a greater efficiency of movement. Your joints are constructed to where muscles between them pull them together, correct? And sometimes we rely on the architecture of the joint to improve the leverage so that when muscles move the joints, they don't have to work as hard. Not much difference than if you're going to go change a tire on a car. Again, most of us just can't lift up the car to change the tire. But if we have some kind of wedge and we take a crowbar, we can push down on the crowbar and it lifts up the edge of the car to allow someone to change the tire, right? Assuming you don't have a jack. Why is it that I can push down on the crowbar and it lifts the car up? Because you wedged a fulcrum close to the car. The longer bar away from it means that I can use less force using the lever to actually lift that car. That's the nature of the leverage. Anytime you have a lever system where the fulcrum is positioned between the heavy object and the moving part, the effector, it's a class 1 lever system. Do you remember as kids on the playground? Do you remember the seesaw? The seesaw had the bar with the 2 seats on the end, and in the middle was the fulcrum of the seesaw. Now, no playground is ever going to design a seesaw to where the fulcrum is so perfectly centered that the actual seesaw just stays perfectly balanced, right? They just put it in there, and then one kid gets on one end and another kid gets on the other end. Let's say that a 200-pound kid sits on the one end and a 50-pound kid gets on the other end. Is that going to be fun for seesawing? Is the little 50-pound kid going to even lift the 200-pound kid up? Not if the fulcrum is more to the middle. But let's say that the fulcrum got pushed closer and closer to the 200-pound kid, then the 50-pound kid would have an easier time because the bar is longer where the fulcrum is closer to the heavy to where it could potentially balance out. In most cases, with the seesaw at the park, the playground, the kids are only 10, 15, 20 pounds different from each other. And then the heavier kid is the one pushing, and then the lighter kid kind of brings it up until the heavy kid brings it back down again. And it's really not the lighter kid, even though the lighter kid feels like they're doing more of the pushing, it's the heavier kid that's doing the work, right? And then I was always the dumb that when the heavy kid just jumped off real quick, then I would go down and instead of using my legs, land on my butt and start crying. Because now that the heavy kid's off, now the resistance is in there so that the kid falls. That seesaw is a type 1 lever system. Again, if you move the fulcrum underneath closer to the heavy side, the resistance, it makes it easier and easier to use less force to still have the same effect of getting the lever to work. If the seesaw was perfectly balanced, fulcrum right in the center, and 2 kids that weighed exactly the same got on, they would just be kind of hanging out there in the air because it would never teeter or totter. Not as much fun as when you've got a fulcrum that allows the lever to work. So the example they use for a type 1 lever system is a seesaw, but a better example would probably be a big long crowbar sticking out from the car where you're pulling down on one end and the car is being lifted up on the other end. Type 1 lever, because the fulcrum is always between the resistance, which is the heavy object, and the effector, which is what's trying to move that heavy object. Now, a type 2 lever system, the fulcrum's at the end of the lever. The heavy stuff's in the middle, and the effector, the lifter or the pusher, is at the other end. Just like a wheelbarrow. Are you familiar with wheelbarrows? You've used them before? The wheel is the fulcrum. You put the heavy stuff in the basket in the middle, and you're lifting from the end. And can't you put a lot of material in the basket if it's a bigger wheelbarrow and lift it up and move all that heavy object? I mean, how long would it take you to individually pick up that stuff and move it without the wheelbarrow? Considerably longer, right? So the wheelbarrow is an effective lever because it allows the heavy object, which is the resistance in the middle, to be lifted with the fulcrum at one end. You know what you don't do? You don't put all the heavy mulch and stuff on the handles at the end and then lift from the basket to the wheelbarrow. But there are levers like that. In fact, many of the body's levers are just like that. If we go back to this picture right here, okay, so when you look at this picture, and it's you can't see it, you can't see the hand moving on the screen because I only see it on my computer, but I'm just going to show you what we have here. The arm is moving, right? So what I'm going to do is zoom out, and I'm going to use my laser pointer. All right, so here is the muscle. The elbow joint is the fulcrum. The heavy stuff is at the end. The muscle's pulling from in between them. So imagine if this was a wheelbarrow and the wheel was right here and the basket was right here, and you put all the heavy stuff on the handles and you tried to lift from the basket. That is this class 3 lever. Class 1, resistance one end, effector the other end, fulcrum in the middle. Class 2, fulcrum at one end, resistance in the middle, effector lifting or pushing at the end. Class 3, fulcrum at one end, lifting from the middle or pushing from the middle, heavy stuff all the way at the end. Put heavy stuff into your hand and try to bend your elbow, it's a class 3 lever because the fulcrum is the elbow, you're pulling from in the middle, holding the heavy stuff at the end. You know what I'm pretty sure of? You're never going to be asked which type of lever it is. The joints of your body are what are the levers. The muscles are just pulling on the bones, and when there's better leverage, the muscles don't have to work as hard. And when muscles don't work hard, they have more energy for the next contraction. When muscles work hard, they start to run out of fuel. They get tired, they get fatigued, they need to rest, they need to recuperate. If you're using those muscles over and over and over again, will the muscle get more prepared for the next contraction? Yes. Will the muscle get larger as a result? Yes. Muscle mass will improve, muscle tension will increase, because the stronger the muscle is, that strength is the result of greater mass and better tension. One of the great things about muscle tension is that the amount of tension is expected because you're using the muscle over and over and over again, which means that the brain is keeping the muscle in a state of preparedness. It's keeping the muscle ready for the next contraction. It's not letting the rope just get loose and flaccid. It keeps the rope tight because it's more efficient to have tighter muscles contracting than looser muscles contracting. So when you work out over and over and over again, yeah, muscles get bigger, but they'll also get more toned. Tone equals, the word means tension. There's just greater tension on the muscle. They won't be like flaccid, loose, soft muscles. They'll be tight, somewhat contracted muscles in a tension state ready for the next contraction. Ultimately conserving energy because shorter muscles don't burn as much fuel as longer muscles do. So the examples on the screen are the seesaw or the crowbar. An example in your body is your skull upon your spinal column. The wheelbarrow effect, example is your ankle mortise joint. And then the shovel, that's a great example. You got all the heavy stuff on the shovel, you're lifting from the middle and holding the handle as the fulcrum. What a great example of a class 3 lever. And there's biceps brachii flexing the elbow again with that heavy object. All right. Muscle fibers, I don't know if this is really that important. A lot of books push for it as far as whether a muscle is fusiform, linear, convergent, if it's oblique, if it is spiral, or if it is pennate, unipennate, bipennate, multipennate. Honestly, I don't know how important understanding that is. What these are all really are just different shapes of the ropes being more or less effective for the type of movement that they're involved in. In other words, a basic muscle is one rope where one end is connected to a bone, another end is connected to a bone, and the muscle shortens between them. But what if you had to design the rope to where the fibers of the rope could only come in one side of the central tendon? That's when you've got this up here called the unipennate muscle. The tendon is on one side, all the muscle fibers are coming into just that one side, versus this one here, where you've got a central tendon and fibers coming into both sides. And then the deltoid is an example of multiple central tendons with all being bipennate coming together as one muscle. So it allows the deltoid to be involved in different directions of movement, whereas a lot of the linear muscles like sartorius or gracilis, those straight line muscles, it's pretty much a straight line contraction. So I just don't know if that's really ever going to haunt you. However, these words will. Whether or not something is a primary mover, whether or not something is an antagonist to that movement, or whether or not something is synergistic to the movement. The other thing that happens with muscle is we get so used to thinking about muscles moving the body that we almost forget that muscles are also there to prevent movement. That sometimes you want muscles to contract so that you don't move. In other words, when you're standing, you've got muscles contracting so that you can't fall down. Well, I shouldn't say can't. I should say so that you don't fall down. Right? You remember the last time that you just stood up and just fell because muscles weren't strong enough to keep you from falling? Remember, gravity's trying to knock you down. Gravity's trying to put you into the earth. I've fallen many times in my life, but it wasn't because my muscles gave out. I fell because I tripped, or I fell because I don't know, probably wanted to fall. I don't know. I don't recall the last time I was so inebriated that I fell, but it's possible. I mean, I've not been sober my entire life. The point being is that there are things that can interrupt your ability to stay upright. But for the most part, you don't fall because muscles don't let you move to fall. Also, when you don't want your knees to buckle and bend, they contract, the muscles around your knee contract against each other to prevent knee from moving. This is when we talk about muscles as stabilizers. And there are certain muscles in the body that are much better at being stabilizers of joints than moving joints, because some muscles are just too weak. A great example is the gracilis muscle. Gracilis muscle runs down the inner thigh. Gracilis muscle is, by definition of where it originates on the pubic bone and where it inserts into the tibia, by definition, it is an adducting muscle of the hip, which means it has to take the weight of the femur, the weight of the tibia and fibula and foot, and all the other muscles that are associated with it, and it has to pull that entire lower extremity into the midline. And you know what gracilis doesn't do well? It doesn't adduct the hip well. It's not strong enough. So even though we call it a hip adductor, it's really a very poor one, given the lack of strength that long, slender muscle has. However, it crosses the medial knee, no different than the way the IT band crosses the lateral knee. And so when it's contracting, it's creating a type of fixation on the inside of the knee. It is actually working to prevent excessive knee movement as a stabilizer, as a fixator of that knee joint. Does it stabilize the knee as well as the quadriceps do? Not at all. But the quadriceps are stabilizing the knee against flexion, and the gracilis is stabilizing the knee against any kind of potential medial excessive movement, like a potential abduction of the knee that should never happen. Let's not worry in learning muscles about how muscles fixate or stabilize. Let's worry about how muscles move the body. How do muscles move the body? And when a muscle is either the major player or one of the major players in movement, we call it a prime mover or a primary mover, or you may call it an agonist. If a muscle is designed to do the opposite, move the joint in the other direction, it's called the antagonist. If a muscle helps another muscle with not nearly the amount of force, maybe, or maybe it has a job somewhere else, but it can help the main muscle move the part, we call that a synergist. You can debate if it's one muscle doing the work as a prime mover, if it's a group of muscle working equally as prime movers, or if a group or a simple muscle needs other helpers to achieve a goal in having a lot of synergists. What's not up for debate is when a muscle is moving the body part in the opposite direction. Because if it moves the body part in the opposite direction, it is antagonistic. So I guess we should throw out examples. We saw biceps brachii before, and I want you to think about this in your mind. Is biceps brachii a prime mover, also known as an agonist? Is biceps brachii actually a synergist, or is biceps brachii an antagonist? And hopefully there's confusion not only in the room but at home. Why? Because I didn't give you enough information. All I asked you was, is biceps brachii a prime mover, an antagonist, or a synergist? And the answer is, it's actually all three, depending on which joint and which direction of movement that joint moves. It is none of those three if it's a joint movement that the biceps brachii doesn't move. Biceps brachii doesn't move the wrist, so it would not have one of these titles with the wrist movers. However, biceps brachii moves the forearm, biceps brachii moves the elbow, and biceps brachii moves the shoulder. Me personally, I would say that biceps brachii is a prime mover of supination of the forearm. I would say that biceps brachii is actually a synergist of elbow flexion, and biceps brachii is an antagonist, not only of forearm pronation, but of elbow extension. You must know the joint and movement of the joint in order to put a title to the muscle. You must have the joint movement. Without it, you cannot title a muscle. So let's change gears. Let's talk about gluteus maximus. Gluteus maximus is a hip mover. It will extend the hip. I would every day of the week say that gluteus maximus is a prime mover or an agonist of hip extension. But you know what else gluteus maximus does? It helps gluteus medius abduct the hip. So I would say gluteus medius is a synergist of hip abduction. It also helps the deep six laterally rotate the hip. So I would say gluteus maximus is a synergist of hip lateral rotation. You know what it doesn't do? It doesn't flex the hip, so it's absolutely an antagonist to hip flexion, which means it would prevent hip flexion as a stabilizer. The more you do that, the easier it is to know when a muscle is the prime mover of a movement of a joint, a synergist in the movement of a joint, or antagonistic to the movement of that joint. The most, again, debatable part is when to decide if it's synergistic versus primary. There are two ways of looking at synergist. Synergistic as a word means assist. Synergists are assisters. They assist in the role of the movement. They help out. So here's what I mean. Let's say we're talking about knee extension. Knee extension is the result of 4 quadricep muscles that can straighten the knee. 4. When you talk about knee extension, You could debate if rectus femoris is the true prime mover and the vastus brothers are just synergists. You can debate that all four quadriceps equally extend the knee, so all four quadriceps as a group are agonists or prime movers. What you can absolutely not debate is that the quadriceps, any of them, flex the knee. They are absolutely antagonists to knee flexion, and the quadriceps would be what would prevent knee flexion. So, is it wrong to say rectus femoris and vastus medialis are synergistic to each other? No, because you're using the word synergistic as they're helping each other achieve the same goal. Now, hamstrings, those three muscles would equally work to flex the knee, right? And that's biceps femoris and the semicisters, semitendinosus and semimembranosus. Which one of them flexes the knee better than the other? I couldn't even tell you. So I would argue that all three hamstrings are prime movers of knee flexion. However, you remember that gracilis that I said was a hip adductor? It can help flex a knee, making it synergistic to knee flexion. Plantaris, gastrocnemius, popliteus. These are muscles that help the hamstrings flex the knee. Even though gastrocnemius' main job is to plantar flex the ankle, it can still help flex the knee. So if I was talking about gastrocnemius, I would say gastrocnemius as a prime mover is an ankle plantar flexor. As a synergist, it is a knee flexor. It helps flex the knee, but it's definitely antagonistic to dorsiflexion of the ankle or knee extension. It's all in which muscle you're talking about and which joint movement. So here, it's showing elbow flexion. Any muscle that flexes the elbow, you could argue, is either a prime mover or a synergist of elbow flexion. Simply put, which muscles are the main elbow flexors? And there are three primary elbow flexors. Biceps brachii, which is not attached to the humerus, brachialis, which is, and brachioradialis, which also is attached to the humerus. These three muscles, biceps brachii and friends, are the major muscles pulling the radius and ulna toward the humerus and scapula so that you flex your elbow. Could you get into a debate as to whether or not biceps brachii is more of a prime mover than brachialis or brachialis more than biceps brachii? Every day of the week we can get into that debate. Brachialis' only job in life is to flex the elbow. And when your only job in life is to flex the elbow, that's a lot of good support for being the prime mover. Watch what happens when I flex the elbow and then pronate the forearm. Biceps brachii just disappeared even though the elbow is still flexed. So how can biceps brachii, which has to let down for pronation, how can it be a primary mover of elbow flexion when it's letting down a bit? Well, that's another bit of support for brachialis being the actual prime mover of elbow flexion. But the truth, biceps brachii, brachialis, and brachioradialis as a trio are working very well to make sure the elbow's bent, whether there's pronation or supination. So I would always argue that brachialis is the most, if you will, the truest elbow flexor, but given the amount of power that you get from biceps brachii and brachioradialis to make sure you flex the elbow, all three of those muscles are the prime movers of elbow flexion, meaning triceps and acromius would be antagonists of elbow flexion. And you remember pronator teres or flexor digitorum superficialis? These are muscles that have forearm and wrist and finger actions, right? That can help bend the elbow. So because flexor digitorum superficialis is a finger flexor, that's its primary movement, but it helps the elbow flex. That's synergistic to the biceps brachii. Again, it's really your choice on how to use those three words. As long as you include that muscle as being part of the major movement, call it a primary mover, prime mover. Call it an agonist. If you feel like you just want to say it's a helper because it's part of a group or it has a job somewhere else but still helps maintain that goal, call it a synergist. But without a doubt, if it does the exact opposite of what's being asked, it's an antagonist. And one of the ways that we really teach muscles, to learn muscles, is we talk about muscles and their antagonists. If I'm talking about biceps brachii, I'm talking about triceps brachii. If I'm talking about quadriceps, I'm talking about hamstrings because they do opposite things to the joint that they move. All right, you good with that? Shorter muscles may only cross one joint. In fact, biceps brachii, biceps femoris, they are not short muscles. They cross multiple joints, meaning they have a movement effect on each and every one of those. However, underneath biceps brachialis only crosses the elbow. Did you know that all three gluteal muscles only cross the hip? Gluteus maximus only crosses the ball and socket joint, goes from pelvis and spinal column, even though that's technically a joint, but it's not a freely movable joint, right? The connection between the sacrum and the ilium is only slightly movable. So it's as if it's one over to the femur. That's what all three gluteal muscles do. Pelvis to femur, only affecting the hip. We would say that that's uniarticular. It's a muscle that affects one joint. What if it's a muscle like sartorius that moves the hip joint and the knee joint? That's a biarticular muscle because it's moving two joints. But what about muscles that are running up my back, all the way up my back, moving all those joint segments? Multiarticular. Don't let it scare you. Is it crossing just a single joint, like the elbow, the hip, the ankle? Is it crossing multiple joints, like the hip and knee at the same time, or the shoulder and the elbow at the same time? Because that's what biceps brachii does. Shoulder, elbow, and forearm. It's three joints. I would say biceps brachii is multiarticular because it's more than two. So I would not even care one bit about this little bit right here. All right. So chapter 20 is the basics of muscle when you're looking at it. But if you want to see each and every individual muscle, we then go to chapter 21, I believe. Let's see if I'm right. Documents, chapter 21 in the Salvo book. Salvo, and I labeled it in mine. I changed it from chapter to what should be kinesiology, maybe? Yep, kinesiology. Because now we're going to see movement kinesiology. Now, this chapter is really big in your book. It goes over all the bones again, which I did without using chapter 21, and then it goes over all the muscles. So we're going to fast forward through the bones and go to the muscles. Let's do it faster. There we go. Okay. If you really want to get good at identifying muscles, you want to look at pictures like this. Front view, back view, front view, back view. The picture that I'm going to use for your test. You remember where I said I took it from? Which book? The Trail Guide. Do you remember which pages I said? 35 and 36. She will be a nice young lady where half of her has some superficial muscles and half of her has deep muscles. So I can actually label and ask of you some of the deeper muscles. This picture is just superficial. This picture is just superficial. So we're going to have to remove the layers. And what your book does in the kinesiology section is it starts at the shoulder and works all the way down to the fingers. And then it goes from the hip and all the way down to the toes. And then it goes from the back and the abdomen and it ends with the face. Okay. The pictures, they're not bad in the Salvo book. They actually have arrows of the direction of contraction that the muscle is going to create movement on. The bigger arrows are the greater direction of movement. The smaller arrows are the secondary, and they're usually just the opposite direction of the bigger arrows. But it allows us to talk about the muscles individually. All right. So I want to make sure that there's no questions related to the reason why we have muscles for movement or for preventing movement, including posture so that you stay upright, tone so that you conserve energy, and don't forget that the chemistry behind muscle generates heat. That it is the interaction of actin sliding over myosin. And the one thing in that PAT video, it was really neat, but it was showing the myosin moving along the actin. I don't like that. It should have shown the actin being pulled across the myosin, but it made it look like myosin was crawling. Because it should have been not this, it should have been this. See the difference? No, you didn't see the difference? Okay. So crawling along the underside of the remote control versus moving the remote control along it while it stays still. That's what really happens. Myosin stays still and it slides the actin along. But not in the video that Pat had. That was really cool though to watch the Titan spring. And what I compare that to is a counterbalance of a garage door. That, you know, you go to open it up and then the counterbalance to the spring of it just takes the door up for you. You don't have to take the heavy door and try to lift it. That's what Titan does for muscle. Creates an elasticity of it. All right. Anyway, I feel like there was one other thing about muscle that I typically want to address. And I'll say it this way. When we talk about muscle, we talk about its ability to shorten. By definition, contractility is shortening. As muscle lengthens, it's called extensibility, and then it gets to a point where it's being stretched. As long as it's being stretched, it better have enough elasticity to not tear. And then as it relaxes, it should return to its original shape, because that's the property of elasticity. Elastic will always go back to its original shape, no matter if you stretch it or squash it or what. It returns to its original shape if it's elastic. If you stretched it and it held that shape, it would be called plastic. Plasticity is shaping. Elasticity is returning to its original shape. So we actually call plastic plastic because they take those polymers and they create a shape from it and it holds that shape. Whereas a rubber band, you pull on it, it goes right back to its original shape, right? But what happens to elastic things as they get older? They get brittle, they lose their elasticity, they're more apt to tearing, aren't they? No different than in your body. Your muscles can get to where they lose elasticity and tear. Blood vessels can lose their elasticity. Ligaments can lose their elasticity. The skin definitely loses its elasticity. It's one of the downsides of aging. And until science and technology can figure out how to keep that elasticity nice and elastic, we will certainly show those signs of sagging and drooping and loss of the suppleness of the skin and tissues. So I hope to see it in my lifetime. It's probably out there, but only affordable or only available to the 1%. No. Conspiracy theory, it's fun. Have you seen it? It was on today's news feed about Tennessee passing a law preventing chemtrails. Have you seen this or heard this story? There's this conspiracy theory that chemtrails are really, you know, when you see the planes and they leave the trails, that they're really chemicals that the planes are dumping in the air. They're called contrails, not chemtrails, but conspiracy theorists call them chemical trails. So Tennessee passed a law to not allow aircraft to ever dump things in the air over airspace of Tennessee. The law doesn't say anything about chemtrails. The law is talking about things that would otherwise block light from getting through, but it's goofy the way it's all said. Right? I was just having fun with that. Okay. Let's talk about the muscles that move the shoulder blade. They are the muscles of scapular movement. Do you remember the 4 major movements of the scapula? You remember us talking about them when we were going over the muscles for the quiz? And none of these muscles, by the way, are going to be, I've never heard of that before, because just about all of them I talked in some way, shape, or form, whether they were on the quiz or not. Correct. Elevation and depression is a scapular movement. When is it elevation? When the scapula is doing what? being pulled straight up, which means that the muscles that lift the scapula have to start above it. And there's only really two things above your scapula, your neck and your head. So the muscles that lift your scapula up start on your skull and on your neck to pull your scapula up to your skull and neck. One of them is called trapezius. The other is called levator scapula. Upper trapezius will take your shoulder and lift it up toward your head. Levator scapula takes your shoulder blade, lifts it toward the side of your neck, and you shrug. You elevate the scapula. Look, when you look at trapezius, it doesn't tell you how it's moving the scapula. It's named for its shape. When you look at the word levator scapula, it's really, put an E on the front of it, elevator of scapula. Because that's named for its lifting ability to pull it straight up. So if muscles that are elevating the scapula are above it, where are the muscles that are depressing the scapula going to be? Below it. So they start on the vertebral column or the ribs that are lower than the scapula to pull the scapula down to the ribs or down to the vertebrae. The lower part of the trapezius pulls the spine of the scapula, which is just the door handle for it, and it grabs that lever and it pulls it down, and the scapula goes down to the ribs or to the vertebrae, because there are muscles like pectoralis minor or serratus anterior that can pull the scapula down to the ribs. But when you pull to the ribs, you're not only pulling down, you're pulling forward. When you pull to the vertebral column and back, you're pulling backward. So the scapula can move forward and backward. What's it called when the scapula moves forward? You recall? Protraction. And when it moves backwards, retraction. So simply, if the muscles are between the scapulae to the vertebral column, they'll pull the scapula backward toward the vertebrae. If the muscles are in front at the ribs, they'll pull the scapula forward to the ribs. And that's how it works. In combination, you can get a little bit of that upward twisting or downward twisting of the scapula, which is called upward or downward rotation, but it's basically lifting, dropping, in, out. Elevation, depression, forward protraction, backward retraction, forward protraction, backward retraction. All right? So there are 6 muscles in total that can move these scapulae. The trapezius is the major mover of the scapula to the backside. It gets help from levator scapula and both rhomboids, major and minor. To oppose those movements, you have pectoralis minor in the front and serratus anterior in the front, and they will pull the scapula forward. Again, it might be a little bit downward, it might be a little bit upward, but it all depends on where the fibers of that muscle are. Pectoralis minor is pulling the scapula down to the 3rd, 4th, and 5th ribs. Serratus anterior is pulling the scapula either up toward the 1st and 2nd rib, in toward the 3rd, 4th, and 5th rib, or down toward 6, 7, 8, and 9. Let's take a look at the muscles and what they look like. On the screen, where's my laser pointer? Oh, I've got different chapters, so I gotta get my laser pointer back. We see the trapezius superficially covering up levator scapula, rhomboid minor, and rhomboid major. And then to the front, we see pectoralis minor and serratus anterior pulling the scapula forward. Serratus anterior is probably the most underappreciated muscle, if not in the entire body, definitely of the upper extremity. Because most of serratus anterior is covered up by other muscles. Pectoralis major covers up serratus anterior right here. Latissimus dorsi covers up the back part of serratus anterior, leaving just these kind of middle 3rd, 4th, and 5th, maybe 6th area, just slightly a little bit exposed, but it's got a very serrated outline. So it's easy to label. You just have to know to look between pectoralis major and latissimus dorsi and see it right there. What I like to do is push my arm out when I'm looking in the mirror, and I'll actually see it bulge up and go, oh, look how strong it is. It's really not that strong. But I remember when I was a kid, I thought those were my ribs sticking out. It wasn't my ribs. It was serratus anterior on top of my ribs, broadening out as the muscle contracted and pulled the scapula forward. So let's go down the line and look at trapezius first. The most superficial muscle of the entire back is trapezius. I don't know why it's showing this picture But there's the top of trapezius and deltoid. That one has trapezius. It has, oh my gosh, it's got splenius capitis, SCM, deltoid, infraspinatus, teres major, teres minor, latissimus dorsi, external obliques, serratus anterior, teres major, teres minor, infraspinatus, supraspinatus, rhomboid minor, rhomboid major. Why is it giving me that picture for trapezius? I just want to see the trapezius by itself. Well, that's not great. Wow, it changed. This is a newer edition than I'm used to using. Well, I guess then I'm just going to have to talk about trapezius and outline it using my pen, my highlighter. I'll use the pen. I'll change the color so that we can see it. We'll make it a highlighter and I'll make it blue. How's that? So it'll stand out. All right. Trapezius, everybody. Let's see if I can do it without making too much of a mess. Is this muscle right here? And if I were to draw it on the other side, it would just look like this. Covering up all of this other stuff, right? So this is the midline. And then these are trapezius. Left one on the left, right one on the right. Do you notice how much of the muscle, levator scapula, rhomboid minor, most rhomboid major, supraspinatus, totally hidden by trapezius? Because trapezius, everybody, is the most superficial muscle of the back. It's not the widest, it's the most superficial. Trapezius is named for its trapezoidal shape, trapezium shape. This is the shape of trapezius. Ready? It's got one side, it's got a second side, it's got a third side, and a fourth side. That is what trapezius really looks like. But this part right here folds down over itself. It folds down like this. So you end up with more of the triangular shape of trapezius because that top corner folded down to the front. So watch how I do it with my shirt. It goes like this to the front. If you were to take it and cut it off and then put it flat on the table, it would look like what I had originally. Let's see if I can erase it properly. It would look like that. So I'll darken in the area that folds over itself. This part is what goes to the front. As a result of it folding over itself, before it was ever known by its trapezium shape, it was actually called the monk's hood muscle because it looked like a hood. But a British anatomist in the mid-1800s kept on describing that it really has this trapezium shape. He wrote about it in his book. It's really a trapezium shape with that top corner folded, and it eventually got to be known as trapezius because of his work with anatomy. So it's really a very basic muscle when it's all said and done, because trapezius is talked about in three parts. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make trapezius, and I'm going to talk about its upper fibers that are folding over itself red. And then it's got its middle fibers that are running pretty much straight over, and I'll make that green. Okay? And then it's got its lower fibers, and I'll make that yellow. We typically talk about trapezius as a three-part thing. the trapezius with its upper fibers that I have in red, the trapezius with its middle fibers that I have in green, and the trapezius with its lower fibers. Because remember, if the muscles above the scapula are pulling up toward the head and neck, it'll elevate the scapula. But notice the yellow part is actually below the scapula, pulling the scapula down to the lower vertebrae. Which means that the upper trapezius and the lower trapezius fibers are antagonistic to each other. Right? Because upper trapezius elevates the scapula, but lower trapezius depresses the scapula. What if they were to both work at the same time? You'd end up with a lot of resistance trying to shrug your shoulders, right? The middle fibers then would be able to easily go and pull the scapula backward, trying to touch the two edges together toward the middle of the vertebral column. Nobody really has enough scapular movement. Some people get really close to their scapular edges touching, but there are very few people on this planet where their scapulas will get off each other. That would be a really, really odd thing to find. There are some people that are really good at moving their scapula and they get really close, but it's just never really both edges hitting each other. The vertebral column gets in the way, the muscle between them called the rhomboids and the trapezius get in the way. So the origin, and I'll do that kind of a dark color, like a black highlight. The origin starts at the occiput right here and is a straight line all the way down to T12. So all of the cervical spine and all of the thoracic spine, straight down the middle, is the origin, the anchor of this muscle. When you look at the insertion is better seen on the next view. Here's the clavicle, okay? Here's the acromion, and here's the spine of the scapula. Everybody see that line that I just drew? The insertion of trapezius is the origin of deltoid. Where the trapezius ends is where the deltoid begins. So this means that directionally, trapezius is trying to pull the clavicle and the scapula up toward the skull, right? Until you get to the middle fibers, which then tries to pull the scapula in toward the vertebral column, and then the lower fibers try to pull the scapula down toward the lower vertebrae. So we're basically taking what is a J-shaped hook, and you're pulling the J up toward the head and neck, you're pulling the J in toward the vertebrae, you're pulling the J down toward the lower vertebrae. So one of the ways that would probably make a little thing, things a little easier, is if they color coded the origin, where this is the first part of the origin circled there, then the second part of the origin circled there, and then the final origin circled there. The origin of each of the parts. But the insertion, again, spine of the scapula to clavicle in the front, all being pulled by those different fibers. Trapezius is relatively flat. Trapezius doesn't have to be big, bulky, and strong because the scapula moves very easily. And the greatest part of it, the thickest part, is where it folds over itself, where it has to be stronger because elevation against resistance is used more often than depression against resistance. And most of us aren't pulling things backwards, keeping our scapula pulled. If so, this is going to be your resting position because the muscle is going to be ready for the next contraction. How many people do you see that are shoulders pulled back constantly? No, we're much more likely to have our shoulders rolled forward where those muscles in the back are a little bit weak. So trapezius is a scapular mover, but not the deltoid. Deltoid is a humerus mover. Here's the back of trapezius. We can see it originating on the occiput. We can see it coming down that top edge that's folding over itself to the clavicle. We can see the middle part going over to the acromion, and eventually we'll see the lower parts coming up to the spine of the scapula. When you remove it, that is when you get to look underneath and see the rhomboid muscles. Now let me highlight the rhomboids. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make rhomboid minor one color. We'll just make it purple. and rhomboid major, and we'll make it light blue. All right, so now you see the two rhombus muscles? Let me try something here. Let me erase just one little part of it. Ah, shoot. Okay, that's that one. And that one. Okay, so those are the two rhombus muscles. Let me outline them so you can see the rhombus shape. And I'll do that with a pen, but also a darker color. Here's one rhombus. Here's the other rhombus. Okay? See the two rhombus shaped muscles? You remember the rhombus shape? The rhombus, if this is a square, right? Well, that was poorly drawn. Erase that. Let's do it with a highlighter. If this is a rhombus, or let's do a square first. Straight over, straight down, straight down, straight over. All right. You have 90-degree angles, right? So each of those is a perfect intersection. But the rhombus doesn't have right angles. It's like you take the square and you squish it, right? Now you have four sides that are equal, but this is the diamond shape of the rhombus. So the rhomboids here, that's the smaller rhomboid, that's the bigger rhomboid. Underneath trapezius, taking the scapula and pulling the scapula into these vertebrae. So working with the middle trapezius to bring the scapulae backwards. We call it abduction of the scapula or retraction of the scapula. Because again, we want the scapula to go into the vertebral column there, to move into the vertebral column with these two rhomboids. Right? See the direction of movement? Now, serratus anterior down here, that's going to pull the scapula away toward the front of the ribs. But the rhomboids work with this middle trapezius, which is pulling in to the vertebra. So rhomboid minor is the smaller of the two. It's the one here on top. And rhomboid major is the larger of the two. It's the one on bottom. Minor over major. However, you cannot feel that little overlap, that little gap. It's really not a gap, it's a slight little overlap. You can see it on a cadaver. We're working with a cadaver, but you're not going to feel it on your clients. So most massage therapists won't separate out minor from major. Most massage therapists, they'll just call them rhomboids. Whether it's minor or major, it doesn't matter. Here's the thing. Notice the direction of muscle fiber with the rhomboids. Okay? With the rhomboids, the direction of muscle fiber is this way, this way, this way, this way. See that? Trapezius is this way, this way, this way. Notice that trapezius is somewhat perpendicular to the rhomboids underneath. So if I were to draw the rhomboids or shadow them on the other side here, that'd be rhomboid minor, that'd be rhomboid major. And again, look at how underneath you can see that the trapezius is running, right, like this. Rhomboids are running, so trapezius and rhomboids are somewhat perpendicular. When you get really good at palpation, you'll be able to feel the difference between trapezius running one direction and the deeper rhomboids running perpendicular. But they're really trying to do almost the same thing. The difference, trapezius, I'm going to show you this with the direction of movement. Trapezius will make the scapula go upward to where it's rotating like that, like getting your arms up over your head. Whereas rhomboids, they're pulling this corner down, so they actually do what's called a downward rotation. Levator scapula and the rhomboids do a downward rotation, and trapezius does an upward rotation. So other than the rotational component, rhomboids are there to help trapezius get the scapula back. Scapular retraction. Christmas tree of the muscle. Okay, what does that mean? Well, when you look at the vertebral column, vertebra, 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 right? And you look at the scapula, edge of scapula here, we'll just go like that. We'll say that's a scapula. Okay, and then we'll make a scapula over here. Okay, so two scapulae, right? Even though that's not drawn well at all. Goodness gracious. Try again. Scapula. All right, there we go. That's a little bit better. All right. So let me draw this other one better. The acromion's over here, the superior angle's right there. So the acromion's going to be over here, superior angle over there. Oh, that's what I did wrong here. Got to do that. Superior angle right there. So it doesn't matter. I'm going to show you what they mean by Christmas tree of the rhomboids. So when you draw a rhomboid minor, and it goes from here to there, and there to there, and that's one minor muscle. Okay, and you draw a major. I'll see if I can darken that green up or lighten that green up just a little bit. Okay, so you see the direction of muscle fiber as I'm drawing it? Kind of slightly downward like that at an angle. All right. Well, if that's the left side, the right side will be doing the same thing, but over here. That's major on the right, and then minor on the right would look like this. All right. So, in order to appreciate what they mean by Christmas tree, the rhomboids or Christmas tree muscle, you look between the shoulder blades. What I'm going to do for you is I'm going to add trigger points. All right. And now I'm going to add adhesions. Now I'm going to add a birthmark. Now I'm going to add a tattoo. And now what I'm going to do is erase the scapulae. See it? The rhomboid's position between the shoulder blades angled like a fir tree, a Christmas tree. So if you can visualize that Christmas tree between the shoulder blades, you can strip through the trapezius, well, it's cross fiber and trapezius, to strip through the Christmas tree of the rhomboids. I think so. There is a test it now, but I don't know if that's it for you, but there's one right there. You'd have to look and see if that's the test. I don't know. If it's not that right there, then it might be in the file or in the clipboards. Is that it? Perfect. All right. So that's what it means by Christmas tree muscles. Nobody's really going to have a birthmark there. Very few people are going to have a star-shaped tattoo there. The adhesions are supposed to be tinsel, and the trigger points are supposed to be ornaments. Sometimes I even draw presents. All right, but those are the rhomboids. The rhomboids work with levator scapula. And levator scapula is this muscle right here. That starts on the side of the neck and goes down to the top corner of the shoulder blade. This muscle right here. It's designed not like the rhomboids trying to pull the scapula into the center of the vertebra, but to pull the scapula up to the side of the vertebrae. And as a result, the scapula goes up toward the side of the neck. That makes sense? So it's very important to zoom in on this. And look right in here. And for that, I better erase the ink. Well, that's weird. There it goes. Notice the side of the neck as the origin. Because put your finger on your neck, just one finger, if you will, and now try to take your shoulder blade and touch that finger. Your shoulder blade's going straight up to your finger, right? Imagine having Frankenstein bolts. The Frankenstein bolts are what stick out the side of your neck. Your scapula is going to the Frankenstein bolts. The only true Frankenstein bolt off your neck is C1. C2, 3, and 4, they're a little bit more in, but C1 sticks way out. And your scapula goes straight up to C1, 2, 3, and 4, not the center, but the side of the neck. They're called transverse processes. Grab skeleton. When you look at the skeleton, you can see that what is straight above the scapula here, here's the corner, is not the center of the spine, but it's this sticking out right there, these right here. So when the muscle goes up, it goes up to the side of the neck. And it pulls this corner to the side of the neck, which is lifting, not the center of the back. It's real important to designate that, because if it was the center of the back of the neck, it would be more rhomboid. This is more vertical because it's going to the transverse processes of the neck. From the transverse process of the neck down to the corner. Hey, by the way, this muscle can also bend the neck to the side by pulling the neck down to the vertebral or to the scapula. But it's called levator scapula, not cervicalis lateral plexus. It's called levator scapula. So it tells you its job is to elevate the scapula by pulling that scapula up toward the side of the neck. C1, 2, 3, 4, transverse process. Most of levator scapula is covered up by trapezius, but not the very side where it starts. You can go behind SEM and in front of trapezius and easily affect levator scapula. It's when you try to affect its insertion on the superior angle of scapula, you have to go through trapezius for that. Any questions with the elevator of the scapula? Doesn't its name tell you what it does? All right. So, what do I want you to know about trapezius? I want you to know that trapezius is the most superficial muscle of the back. What do I want you to know about levator scapula? I want you to know that levator scapula originates from the transverse processes of C1, 2, 3, and 4. So that the superior angle can go up to the side of the neck, shrugging the shoulders toward the side of the neck. What do I want you to know about the rhomboids? That the rhomboid muscles are the muscles that adduct or retract the scapula. So let's say that you were working with your client and you wanted to palpate those muscles, just have them bring their scapulae together. You'll feel the muscles bulge up and you'll know when working between the shoulder blades where those rhomboids are. They are not ball and socket joint movers. They're definitely not elbow movers or wrist movers or forearm movers. They are found between the scapulae, moving the scapulae. They are scapular retractors. What do I want you to know about the serratus anterior? Well, let's take a look at it and talk about serratus anterior. Serratus anterior really is one of the most underappreciated muscles, as I said earlier, because we kind of forget that something's got to pull the scapula forward. Something has to pull the scapula forward. And it can't all be pectoralis minor. Pectoralis minor has one heck of a lever, though. What a great lever. Here's what I'm going to show you with the scapula, if I can find it. Okay. When your scapula, this is the front of the scapula, this is the back of the scapula. When trapezius is moving the scapula, it grabs the spine and the acromion. It grabs this and it moves it up, in, down. When the rhomboids grab the scapula, they don't have this nice lever. The rhomboids grab the edge and pull the edge in. Levator scapula pulls the corner up, rhomboids pull the edge in. Okay? Serratus anterior, when it comes around from the ribs, it doesn't go to this lateral side. It continues all the way to the same border as the rhomboids. You with me? So that means that the muscle's running underneath, okay, because it's coming around, this is in the back, it's coming around from the ribs in front, so it comes underneath and connects like that to the edge of the scapula. So when it pulls the scapula, it's actually pulling the inside edge forward to the ribs. So I'm not going to, look, if I hold it like this and pull it, the scapula stays flat to my belly, and look where the humerus would be. We don't want that. We want this edge to be the serratus edge, so that the scapula comes forward like that. The same edge that the rhomboids are pulling to the vertebrae, this medial border, the entire border is serratus anterior, wrapped around and pulling the scapula forward, and then rhomboids pull it back. Serratus anterior pulls it forward, rhomboids pull it back. Always keeping the scapula flat to the front of your body, not letting it stay to where the scapula faces the body, but stays flat to the front. This allows the humerus to stay without ever getting twisted in front of you. Serratus anterior pulls the medial edge in, rhomboids pull the medial edge, or serratus anterior again forward toward the ribs, rhomboids backwards. So that's why they show these together. Again, let me show you the arrows. Rhomboids are pulling the scapula this way. Serratus anterior is pulling that same border that way, opposite direction. So it's the difference between retraction and protraction. Rhomboids retraction, serratus anterior protraction. But serratus anterior gets help because at the very front of the ribs, third, fourth, and fifth ribs, Going to this lever that's sticking out and taking that lever and pulling it like this to the ribs in front is pectoralis minor. See pectoralis minor grabbing the coracoid? And it pulls the scapula forward to the ribs. Pectoralis minor is completely deep to pectoralis major. Completely deep to it. You cannot see any of that if pectoralis major is in the way. But this is the coracoid, and you're pulling it down and forward to those third, fourth, and fifth ribs. There is rhomboid pulling one way, serratus pulling the opposite. Serratus anterior gets help from the pectoralis minor. Now, I want to show you serratus anterior working. And for that, we're going to leave the PowerPoints. I can do it as a graphic interactive format, I think. And let's give it. Okay. I want you to watch the scapula moving here. You see the scapula? Here's pectoralis minor. There's serratus anterior. Serratus anterior is pulling the scapula forward to the ribs. Pectoralis minor is pulling the scapula forward to the ribs. Let me make this bigger so you can see it easier. That is how those two work. They're not pulling the scapula backward toward the vertebral column. They're pulling the scapula to the ribs. Pectoralis minor taking the coracoid pulling to the ribs. Serratus anterior taking the medial edge pulling the ribs. And notice that the humerus is just staying out there to the side as the scapula comes forward upon the rib cage. That is how serratus anterior. Can you appreciate the jagged outline from rib to rib to rib to rib to rib in its origin? Can you see pectoralis minor, this triangle of muscle pulling that coracoid? What a great lever that coracoid is. Brilliant. So they are pulling the scapula forward. We call that protraction. Is pectoralis minor also doing some downward movement? Is the lower serratus anterior pulling down? Yes. But for the most part, it's going forward. Here's another version. That's not what I wanted. Come on, get out of the way. Thank you. The other version is this. Watch the punch of serratus anterior. If you notice on here, it's being stretched, right? As the scapula goes backward to with trapezius, it stretches the serratus anterior, and then when it's time to punch this guy, serratus anterior contracts and quickly pulls the scapula forward at the same time as the extensor muscles of the elbow are straightening the elbow, and deltoid and pectoralis major are bringing the humerus forward. But look at serratus anterior get stretched and then contract. Stretched as the humerus in the scapula go backwards, and then contracts to bring the scapula forward very quick. Serratus anterior is often called the boxer's muscle because it creates the jab effect, right? See how the scapula comes forward? So this is the proto guy that was telling us about our joint shapes and the skeleton punching him in the mouth for saying something stupid. But again, that's the real version. And then I saw one other. Watch it spin around. You can see how big serratus anterior really is. Very underappreciated. Yeah, but its jagged edge is what really makes it stand out and why we call it serrated to the front, serratus anterior. All right. So when I work with you again on Tuesday, and by the way, here's one more, just so you can see it. There's the serratus anterior bringing the scapula forward. When I work with you on Tuesday, we're going to go and talk about the ball and socket joint muscles, then the elbow muscles, the forearm muscles, the wrist, right? We're just going to follow the line of the book. The goal is to go through all the muscles that the book goes through over the next 3 or 4 lectures, right? Talk muscle pathologies, And we will be taking our final on our last day of class, which is May 9th. May 9th. I thought it was May 16th, but I looked at the calendar. Graduation, is that a test? Is that an out of town day for you? Oh. It feels like it's soon, but you'll be ready. Because remember, we've actually talked about all these muscles. Now we're just reinforcing and putting it all together. And still, most of the test is identifying. 53 of the 100 questions are identifying from the picture on 35 and 36. Another 10 matching of pathologies, only 3 true false, and you ready? 34 multiple choice. Some are going to be about position of muscle, some about groups of muscle, some about origin, insertion, or action, but really mostly basics. Okay?
So the lady, so we have to know the front and back of that lady.
Page 35 and 36, yep. We'll even practice a few times before we take the test.
That way I have to talk about all dog.
Okay, so the game plan is May 9th. That's fine. Whatever you feel like you need to do. Okay, everybody. I will see you on Tuesday. Have a great rest of your night. Enjoy your weekend. Be safe. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.